In 1948, just 3 years after the end of World War II, the Western Allied powers faced a crisis that tested their resolve in a new Cold War. The Western Allies, consisting of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, faced a severe crisis in the war-ravaged capital of their former enemy, Berlin. Soviet forces had blocked all land routes into the German capital, threatening to starve a city of 2.25 million people. Hello and welcome to Anything History. I've always been fascinated by the Berlin Airlift. It's such a unique story that happened at the very beginning of the Cold War. It really is a story of how the Western Allies, learning important lessons from the beginning of World War II, came together to save the capital of their former enemy and confront a new adversary. The roots of the Berlin blockade and airlift begin at the end of World War II, when Germany was divided among the victorious Allies. Each nation, the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, had an administrative area known as an occupation zone. Berlin was inside the Soviet occupation zone, but the city was divided like Germany among the four victorious Allies. The Berlin blockade began just 3 years after the end of World War II, and tensions between the West and the Soviet Union were rising. Now, keep in mind, it was also 2 years after Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech, and the Soviets were already tightening their control over Eastern Europe. Berlin was this little island of democracy, and that was a problem for the Soviets. The division of Europe between the Soviet Union and the West was more than ideological. It had real consequences. A line had been drawn right across Europe, with the Soviet Union and their communist allies on one side, and the Western democracies on the other. The Soviets controlled all of Eastern Europe except the western half of the German capital, Berlin. It was against this backdrop that the first crisis of the new Cold War began. Now, as you can imagine, the state of Germany was pretty bad after the war. Millions of people had been displaced, and the country was in ruins. The Allies had to struggle with how to rebuild Germany and bring it back from the ashes. The Western Allies chose to introduce a single currency in their occupation zone, the German Deutschmark. For their part, the Soviets saw this as a challenge to their authority and a violation of the occupation agreement. On June 24th, they withdrew from the Allied Control Council, the Allied body charged with governing occupied Germany. The Soviets then declared the new currency illegal and began blockading streets across the city. They slammed the door on West Berlin, closing all roads, railways, and waterways into the city. The Allies faced a difficult decision: either find a way to support West Berlin or wash their hands of a potential catastrophe. The Western Allies remembered the failed appeasement strategy that led to the start of World War II. During that time, very few people in the West wanted to stand up to Hitler because the tragedy of World War I was still fresh in everyone's mind. There was little support for a new war at that time. 1948, however, was different from 1930. The Western Allies clearly saw the threat posed by the Soviet Union, who had by then taken control of Eastern Europe. The United States, the United Kingdom, and France committed to saving the city. On June 26, Britain and the United States initiated Operation Vittles, a massive airlift operation to supply West Berlin with food and other essentials. Now, this was no small task. Imagine the city the size of Chicago cut off completely. No roads, no trains, and you can't even get there by using a river. That was West Berlin in 1948. Over 2 million people basically trapped by the Soviets. The first American and British planes arrived at Tempelhof and RAF Gatow on June 28th. Initially, the airlift had to deliver 4,500 tons of goods daily to West Berlin. Later, that had increased to 5,000 tons by autumn. Most of this consisted of coal, with around 2,000 tons being food. The Soviets restricted West Berlin's electricity to just 2 hours a night, making coal essential for heating homes in the coming winter. In November, the French completed Tegel Airport in 90 days to reduce the pressure on Tempelhof and Gatow. The British also used Sunderland flying boats from Hamburg to supply Berlin from its waterways. In late July, Major General William H. Tunner was given operational command of the airlift. Tunner was renowned for his success in supplying Allied forces in India via an aerial supply line across the Himalayas during World War II. Tunner immediately set about creating a continuous procession of aircraft, aiming for landings just 3 minutes apart. Because the aircraft had to navigate through East German airspace, They were limited to 3 designated routes. These routes would be known as the West Berlin Air Corridor. These air corridors were just 20 miles wide, requiring aircraft to fly at a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet. All 3 routes converged at a central hub over Berlin. Tunner had designed the airflow to Berlin to maximize efficiency. There could be as many as 26 airplanes in the corridor simultaneously. Each aircraft was guided through the air corridor by ground radar and given a single chance to land in Berlin. If a pilot missed their approach, they would return to their home base and re-enter the cycle for another attempt at Berlin. As the crisis escalated, diplomats were engaged in behind-the-scenes negotiations with the Soviets. The Soviets proposed lifting the blockade under the condition that the Western Allies withdraw the Deutschmark. Although this proposal was ultimately rejected, it highlighted the Soviets' willingness to negotiate. Now, some historians suggest that Stalin's decision to sustain the blockade for such an extended period was influenced by Germany's unsuccessful attempt to supply Stalingrad during World War II. Even with the stress of the flights and deliveries, the airlift kept going, and despite some tense moments and close calls, especially during those blackouts, Stalin never gave the order to shoot down any planes. That would have gone too far and been considered an act of war. Stalin was playing a very dangerous game, seeing how far he could push the West, but he also wanted to avoid an all-out war. It was very much a balancing act. Ultimately, the Soviets did lift their blockade after 11 months on May 12, 1949. They reopened all land routes into Berlin. However, the airlift did continue until September 30th to ensure that Berlin had enough supplies on hand in case the blockade was reinstated. At its peak on April 17, 1949, Tunner's air supply system delivered 13,000 tons of cargo, the equivalent of 600 railroad cars in a single day. This remarkable feat, known as the Easter Sunday Parade, showcased the teamwork and determination of the Western Allies. Throughout the blockade, Allied air crews flew 189,000 missions, totaling 600,000 flying hours and covering 92 million miles. They delivered 2.3 million tons of supplies to the beleaguered citizens of Berlin. For their part, ground crews operated with remarkable efficiency, unloading planes in an average of 30 minutes, with one crew setting a record by unloading a C-54 Skymaster in just 5 minutes and 45 seconds. The 15-month operation maintained an impressive safety record despite continuous flights in severe weather both day and night. However, it was not without its cost. 12 airplane crashes resulted in the loss of 30 service members and 1 civilian during the operation. For the Western Allies, the Berlin Airlift was such an important moment at the very beginning of the Cold War. It showed they learned some important lessons from the beginning of World War II, but also how to use a soft diplomacy, not bombs, but food and coal, to win a battle in the Cold War. This was very important because it showed the West would stand by its allies when a crisis occurred. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. It really does help the channel out.